Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, a show that examines all aspects of sexuality, from physical to emotional to spiritual. Join our hosts as they discuss age-old questions, common misconceptions, and the latest topics surrounding sex. They'll tackle topics about sexuality from the complicated to the hilarious and everything in between. GSMC Sex Podcast is your show for all of your questions about sex, even some you might not have thought of yet.
Hello and welcome to Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson. When your sex isn't turning you on, what is happening? Now, is this a crisis moment for you? I mean, it would be for a lot of folks. When the sex isn't happening, then it's that moment where you take it in and you're saying, wow, this isn't working. Something is not as exciting and as fantastic as we remembered it to be, or as I remembered it to be. And I'm worried. I'm worried my partner's going to not be interested anymore. And if that happens, then the relationship's gone and things are just going to start falling apart. The attitude's going to happen and we're not going to get along. And I am going to be stuck in a situation that I'm going to have to do a lot of negotiating in order to make it better. And I don't even know what's wrong right now. Can you imagine being in that scenario? So when your sex isn't all it's cracked up to be, okay, think about a few things here. And I'm going to give you some topics and we're going to cover this. So now, is this a failure to be attractive to each other? Is this a chemistry thing? Because, you know, when you first get together, you have that chemistry going. And some people avoid talking about the sex talk because you don't want that to be the first thing to come out, because you don't want to make it seem like that's all you're interested in. I mean, obviously you're attracted to the person. That's that chemistry that I'm talking about. And eventually you get around to the sexual part because you obviously want that to be in the relationship. And you've had your relationships before, and the one thing you don't want is you don't want to go into another one that's going to have bad sex. So eventually you get around to that conversation. And if you continue the conversation, then you know there's some chemistry going on there. So like I said, is this a failure to have that chemistry, or is it communication? So in other words, the words, are we not able to get on the same page when it comes to talking? Because, you know, we all have our own filter. So when we're talking, we're feeling, we're emoting, we're trying to communicate. And if the person that's hearing what we're saying is not understanding what we mean, that is a point of friction. And depending upon who you are, your personality type, you know, everything stops right there. Now, some people can have sex, and no matter what the circumstances are in the relationship, but some people cannot. I mean, they are stopped by those moments, and they want to get resolution. Now, this isn't a man or woman kind of issue. It's not one does it more than the other. It's just the fact that it's happening. And when you're experiencing that, you're experiencing it. So I kind of asked another question, too. Are you and your partner not turned on by the same thing anymore? Because when you first got together, you probably found a number of things that appealed to you both, and you've done them. And maybe we're at a point where you've had the repetition and you're in kind of a sexual rut. So you need to springboard into something a little more interesting, a little more challenging, a little more thoughtful maybe. You know, that's where the communication comes in. And if the words aren't happening, boy, you're going to have a real challenge with that one. Are you having a difficult time with sex, or maybe is sex the relationship itself? So let me say that differently. You have a relationship and you're just having a difficult time with the sex, or is sex the relationship? Big difference. Because if you have a relationship and sex is a component of it and things aren't going so well, then you have other things that are involved. You have other investments that you're going to hang on to. That's a part of the big picture. So we're probably going to be a little more committed, a little more invested in trying to make this work. If sex is the relationship, and I may wax on this, expand on it a little bit more later, but if sex is the relationship, then you really might be challenged in trying to hang on to something like this. Because if the chemistry is gone, and it's quite possible that this particular kind of relationship has just played itself out for one or both partners. And trying to rekindle that is more of a memory, and you just might not. I mean, unless you have something else that you have going on that would make it worth your time to want to continue. So again, that is if the relationship is just sex. That's a hard one. That's a hard one to keep going on. If it's not working, it's not working. And you just sometimes have to walk away from those kinds of relationships because one or both of you is looking for a change. And that may not come from the two of you for each other. Like I said, that is if you just came together to be lovers. You know, no strings attached relationships have that component to it. And when somebody is ready to just sort of leave and because they find something else a little more tantalizing. And, you know, the part about that kind of makes that hard, it's the rejection. Because if you're the one that's leaving, you find something else a little more interesting. It's like, well, here's a shiny object over here and I want to go to that. But if you're the person that's being left and you're feeling like, wow, I'm being rejected here? Am I being rejected? I didn't think it was that bad. So again, it goes back to the communication or the perception of what you think is going on. And if you didn't catch my podcast, the other one, I talked about no strings attached in some of the ins and outs of those kinds of circumstances. So if it's just a sex only relationship, basically, and it may be no strings attached, when you reach the end of those kinds of connections, then it's just walk away. That's probably easier said than done, but you can't make somebody want to go to bed with you if they're not interested in it. I mean, bad things happen when you try to make people go to bed with you that don't want to go to bed. So let's stay out of that zone because that's all kind of danger there. So back to, you know, the failure in terms of the attraction and the chemistry. Think about what brought you together in the first place. I like to go back to basics in something like this. It's really knowing, and I don't mean guessing, I mean knowing what brought you together in the first place. Was it the look? Were you shared activities? You had plans to do other things together and you enjoyed each other so much, you were spending so much time together that sex just became part of the relationship as opposed to you just becoming friends and staying in the friendship zone. So if you can take apart that aspect, then we can begin to drill down into what's happening in the relationship and why the sex isn't, why you're not turned on, or one or both of you. I think one of the things that I find really interesting in a relationship, at least when it's first starting out, the attraction, a lot of it has to do with the fact that somebody is willing to listen to you, willing to spend time with you. Because think about it. What do we want from somebody? It's their time. It's their attention. And as long as that's there, then we don't question it. When we, say, get busy and don't have time for each other, then what's the one thing people say about the circumstance? They say, well, you don't pay attention to me. You don't spend time with me. I don't feel appreciated. I feel ignored. So time is definitely a factor in relationships, and quality time at that. So it's not just time, but quality. You really have to make it mean something in order for it to land on your partner and have the significance of saying, yes, I do care. I pay attention. I listen to you. Look, I'm going to have to take a break, and I'm going to come right back and talk about this some more. Stay tuned.
Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
And we're back. This is John Johnson in the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, and I'm talking about when your sex isn't turning you on. So we're probably not having great sex at the moment, but what we're talking about is how to get back to that, and we have to deconstruct this in order to reconstruct it. And when you first got together, because at the end of the last segment I was talking about what brought you together, and it's what do people want? People want your time. They want your attention. And that's something that's a commodity, because everybody is not committed to giving you just endless amounts of their time, because your life, it's a timeline. It begins and it ends, and you want to get something for it. So if you're being a good listener, then you want somebody to listen to you, and vice versa. So that's how it works in relationships. And one of the things that tends to break down in relationships, I don't care what it is when people start to feel like they're being taken for granted. Either you're not giving me gifts, you're not paying me compliments, you're not spending time with me anymore, or you're breaking commitments, things that we have planned, and they don't seem to be important to both of us. They're important to me, but they don't seem to be important to you. And like I say, it doesn't matter which person in the relationship. It's not whether it's a man saying it or whether the woman is saying. The fact that it's being said and we're having a breakdown. So the sexual chemistry it's not as high. It's not up there like it was when we first got together, because remember, when you first got together, you wanted that person. You wanted their time and attention. And what is it about sex that makes it so valuable? The time you get to spend with this person in an intimate way. There's pleasure involved in it. See, that's very significant. So I want you to think about that. If you are having an issue where your sex isn't, it's just not happening, it's not popping, think about that. The time element. So now, is it communication? So when I'm talking about communication, this is what I mean. I mean conveying your idea, your feelings, your convictions. That's important. And it's bilateral. So they do theirs, you do yours. And why is that important? It's because when you say, I love you, does it mean I love you? Or is there some filter that kicks in and that might have a hint of sarcasm to it? Are you responding to someone's need, desire to feel important, feel loved? Or are you just throwing it out there and it doesn't have any meaning? Now, this is something that's critically important to people who, in terms of communication, words really matter. Words of affirmation. Some people like touch. Some people like acts of service. Some people like gifts. And when it's the words that matter, then they really do have to have a sense of significance from the person that's saying them, and not just some sort of canned answer or canned response. Because that speaks of insincerity, and it's very patronizing. And one does not want to feel like their love or their affection or their attention is being patronized, because that's very condescending. And it makes people feel very, very angry. And that will shut down sex really quick. So if you've experienced one of those, either from your partner or had the feeling yourself, Now you understand a little bit of the pathology behind this and why you avoid it. So you want to think about it. So again, this is the communication part. And it's about being able to exchange ideas clearly. Because saying something and being misinterpreted or misunderstood is really important. We have to get right back down to basics. And you don't want to get too complicated with the sentences and, telling people they misunderstand this or that. We know there's a misunderstanding. So it would seem in occasions like this, when someone is not trusting your words and the sincerity, then there's the word, the trust. Something about the trust is broken, and you got to figure out what that is. And it could be the fact that there was a broken commitment. We promised to go do something and it never happened. And in the case of, and I know this happens in relationships, one could just have simply forgotten because of stress. I am definitely guilty of things like that. When I get overwhelmed, because I make mental notes. I don't necessarily write things down because I have a pretty good memory. But when I get stressed about things, and I mean in the really worked up stress, not the happy stress, but the stress like, oh my God, something is about to fall apart here. Then I start to forget things. And I become one of those that might forget timelines. I'm supposed to be somewhere at 7:30. I might remember it at 7:30. I was supposed to be there. Wow, okay, I'm going to be late. And some people are real sticklers for time. And I have certainly been guilty of that. But there it is. The trust thing is really, really important to people. And if you're trying to communicate an idea and you just seem to not get a lot of buy-in, go back to that. Maybe it's trust, because at one time your words really mattered and you were probably fairly easily understood. But now you're getting to a place where you're having to, say, maybe over-explain something that should be fairly simple. So you can go back to the communication part and, work on that. So, and now here's something that happens. And this happens all the time in relationships. Are you and your partner just not turned on by the same thing? Because at one time, you may have been. Or maybe you were more so and your partner was willing to sort of go along with it because they were buying into the relationship, and at least the sexual part, to say, hey, there's mutual enjoyment in this. But maybe it's played out. And you want to be in conversation about that. What keeps you interested in the sex? Remember, if it's not hot, if it's not popping, then you want to be talking about what's missing. So there's a thought. Are you just not turned on by the same things anymore because they've played out? Now, here's another idea. When you think about what got you two together in the first place, because I like this one. When you meet each other, you think about all kinds of things. And you fantasize about going on vacations, having sex all day, every day of the vacation till you're tired. You go out and get food, you come back, you make love, have fun. You're enjoying yourselves. But what got you together in the first place? Was it the idea that you met someone who understands you philosophically, gets your ideas? Maybe you had had a similar childhood and things are just clicking. And if you're no longer involved in the kinds of things that made your communication, let's say, interesting and enjoyable in the first place, then you got to find something that you two can bond with each other about, a cause, and not just a crisis, but I mean something that you both can really enjoy. That'll give you some quality time together, and that's a good way to build intimacy with someone. And I want to emphasize quality time, because I've seen relationships where someone just goes because, well, I'm their partner and I'm just tagging along. Now, some people are going to insist that because you're the partner, you have to be there. And some people really get bothered by the fact, well, if you're just tagging along, you don't enjoy being here. Why are you here? It's the proverbial thing. Have you seen this situation where somebody's going shopping, and I'm not going to say the woman, and then the guy just sort of tags along? He's just there. He's sort of a placeholder. He holds the purse. He sits down and waits till she's finished, and then they leave and go somewhere else. Well, I give him credit for being there. But you have to go back to the woman and ask her, are you really happy to have him there just tagging along? And if you are, then that's a great asset. You guys are there to support each other. Some people really don't want their partner there if they don't really, really want to be there. That's a challenge for them to feel like they're connected. It's like kids having to go somewhere they don't want to go. They just sort of pout and they stomp, and sometimes grown-ups are just big kids. Hey, look, I'm going to take a break, and I'll come right back, and I'm going to cover this some more.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Hello, and welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson, talking about when your sex isn't turning you on. And I've shared a number of scenarios, and I've given you bits and pieces about how to do the problem solving, at least the mindset behind it. But look, I'm going to focus, in this last segment, I'm going to focus on how we can really drill this down and have a conversation so we can resolve it. So one of the things that you have to do in order to problem solve, you really do have to spend time thinking about the problem. And I don't mean just saying things off the top of your head, because it's really easy to be defensive. And this can be a challenge to do when it's just the two of you. And this is why when people are in therapy, it works. And sometimes it's a little easier because the therapist is the referee. They're listening, they're impartial, and their idea is really to help both of you understand each other. And to explain that when you are feeling your feelings, that it's pretty natural to feel the way that you do. Because one of the things that happens in couples when they're trying to problem solve is one might not feel the other is justified in feeling the way that they're feeling. And I got to tell you, when it comes to feelings, you really don't get to tell other people how to feel. You just have to be in the experience of letting them say what they want to say and validating that. Why? Because that actually helps de-escalate the situation. Validating what your partner feels. Denying them the satisfaction of your understanding does not help the situation. This is critical. Now, you can use this particular tool, and I'm not going to say tactic or technique because it's not about deception. This is really about having a tool in your toolbox to be able to deal with conflict. And validating the feelings of other people is a very important thing to be able to do. And it requires empathy. And some people have a challenge with empathy. That is being able to feel what the other person is experiencing. Now, maybe you can do it because you've had that same experience. And you might be able to help de-escalate things by saying, oh, yeah, I remember when that happened to me. Then you have some common ground to start from. But don't spend too much time there because you're not trying to take away from what your partner's time to be able to express themselves. Now, as the person who's speaking, you have to be precise. You got to drill this thing down. You don't just get to go on and on and on because these things can get real protracted and we don't get to solve the problem. But it's about listening to your partner, express themselves. And before you get to these things, like I said, you don't want to just be speaking off the top of your head. You got to spend time with this. So be in your own space, and if you have to write down how you're feeling. You may even find that there's a common thread to it, which you may have 8 things on the page, and they're all pretty similar, so it can actually be fairly simple. You can solve the thing that sort of ties all of them together and eliminate most of the problem on the page. And it's very skillful if you can find that there's something very common about it. And this is the thing that I said earlier in the podcast. I was talking about trust and how important that is, because when you say something, and if you have to over-explain, especially when things started out fairly simple, but if you're having to over-explain, there's probably a trust issue here. And you might go back to figuring out, okay, did you break a promise? Did you break a commitment of some type? And at least find out, and then go back to that situation, apologize for it, and try to fix it. And that usually helps get things on track. Now, one of the other things that I have to emphasize is this is not about being passive-aggressive, because you can see there are times when someone is going to be in a position of power, and the other person is going to be in the position of having to, say, make up for having made a mistake or misunderstanding something or something like that. So, and the passive-aggressive types tend to take advantage of the situation, and I implore you to not be doing that here. This is about de-escalation, because these things will come back to haunt you. So it's about having empathy. It's about showing grace, forgiving your partner, and wanting to move forward. And this is what helps pull the relationship back together. We can have the intimacy and we can move forward. And that's ultimately what we want to do, is we want to get back to having good sex. We want to enjoy each other, appreciate which each of us brings, and build on that. And the other thing that I want you to think about this, and this usually helps get the conversation going in a good direction. Think about the successes that you've had. Really spend some time going over that, and that's to really help you realize that you two are on the same team. One can pull and the other could push, but as long as you're going the same direction, hey, it's going to work. And you have to see it that way. A person doesn't have to do it exactly your way all the time, because that's not going to work, because there's two people. But like I say, if one is pushing and one is pulling and you go in the same direction, you've got a great start. But here is what I'm saying. I'm going to crystallize this right here. Talk about your accomplishments together, where you both had something at stake and it worked. Because that helps you feel good about each other. That helps rebuild the trust. And that's really important when it comes to problem solving. And I think you should write down what it is that you're going to do. Because like I said, in the case of myself, who at times when things are very stressful, I become very forgetful. Well, it's important for me to then take the pen out and start writing things down so that I can stay on task and put a timeline on it to show that, look, I'm trying. And I think you have to acknowledge your partner's efforts to be there. So yeah, this is relationship stuff, but this is how we build back to having the intimacy and having the sex that we want. Because remember, that's the thing that fell apart. And once we get back there, then we can enjoy it as much as we did before, and probably even better, because now we know that we have another part of the foundation that helps pull this stuff together, that makes it great. So I'm going to close with the idea that you can be successful in turning your sex back into something that you want when there's trust, when there's validation, empathy, love, commitment, understanding. Those things help make it worthwhile, and I think we can all do that. So put your effort into it and make love. I'm John Johnson. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From sex and relationships to health and wellness, life and happiness, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast.